Welcome to Celtic State of Mind. I'm John Dykes, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Natasha, Meikle and Lawrence Connolly for another instalment of the ACSOM Bulletin. Never a dull moment. Let's get stuck right into it. Natasha, Meikle, you were part of a discussion just last night around the possibility of Peter Lawwell remaining at Celtic Park, just not in the capacity of CEO. Sum up the discussion you've had. What's your feelings on that?
Yeah, so it's something that Pat Bonner and Tom English were debating the previous evening, the Sunday night, about whether Lawwell would be staying in the board in some sort of capacity. Would it be a formal role? Would he just be simply at the end of the phone for Dominic Mackay? And Tom English thought that this would be a good idea. Pat Bonner, on the other hand, thought it would be a terrible idea. I was on last night discussing it with the Sportsound team, and yeah, I've got to come down on the side of Pat Bonner on this one. I think it would go down very badly if Celtic were to make an announcement, and as part of that announcement, Peter Lawwell was going to be staying at the club. For a lot of the fans, me included to be honest, Lawwell must shoulder a significant amount of the blame for Celtic's downfall this season. Yes, he has brought us success in the past, but clubs like Celtic can't live on past success. Ultimately, Lawwell's the one that appointed the management team. He's the one overseeing the major decisions at Celtic. And all of these decisions have been wrong over the last year, arguably longer. And this isn't a reaction to, not winning the league this year. The Celtic fans have been critical of Lawwell for a number of years. So I don't think it would go down well if he was to finally be leaving after 17 years and then not actually leave. I get 100% that, with appointments at this level, a transition period is needed. Mm-hmm. Lawwell, understandably, undoubtedly has a lot of experience, a lot of contacts, a lot of knowledge of the club. There needs to be a transition period, but that's why Mackay came in early, to get that underway and to have that happen now. Do we need Lawwell to hang around after that? I don't think so. My concern is that we're bringing Mackay in for fresh new ideas, a new perspective, a new influence, and having Lawwell in the background, regardless of what sort of role it is, could mitigate the effect that Mackay coming in is going to have. Lawwell is known around the club as being the boss, the one in charge. If he's still about, that influence or perception is going to be hard to shift. So my concern would be, regardless of what role Lawwell was potentially staying in, it could totally mitigate the impact of Mackay.
This is something, Natasha, that came up, I think, last week on one of the ACSOM bulletins, almost as a what-if scenario. We led it, I think it was Thursday, actually. I spoke to JP and Declan about it. And that was following some rumblings that were coming into ACSOM that this indeed may well have been in the works. So it was interesting to see how the news has filtered into the mainstream media, as it were. But it's great that you were part of that discussion. I'm looking at the scenario and thinking, how on earth could someone, not only the ex-boss, as it were, because day to day he is running the football club, how could he be anything other than that? That's the biggest thing for me. So having your involvement and your influence in every aspect of Celtic Football Club, from who's going to be signed to where the smoking bus shelter is situated at the stadium, everything. I mean, that's micromanagement. How do you then switch that off and fulfil a completely different role? And I suppose the flip side of that, and I'm going to bring this one over to Lawrence here, the flip side would be, yes, we are in a situation where it has been an absolute disaster of a season, and also in a lot of these discussion points will feed into other discussion points as we go on. It's easy to forget the good aspects of what Peter Lawwell brought to the club. So here's a man who has been called by those at Lyon as one of the best negotiators in world football. Yes, we have turned a profit on various players, and let's not forget, somehow we managed to get our money back for Patrick Klimala, apparently. So he is good at that aspect. However, surely, Lawrence, and I've got to say I agree with Natasha on this one, surely a clean break is required here.
I think, transition period. I wouldn't be expecting the same to stay on for that, but yeah, I think Natasha's right. That it needs to be a defined transition period. I think if he was to be announced that he was staying on in an indefinite role, this is his new position at the club, it's not going to go down well at all with the fans. Never mind how it plays with Dominic Mackay. When he's doing something, as someone running away to Peter with stories, and it's transition period, advisory capacity, defined term, then moved on. That's it. And I think transition period at this level is about 6 months, isn't it? So hopefully be gone for the new season.
Again, these things come into us, and we're always reminded of all the great work that Peter Lawwell did at the club. But Jungle Lion comes in to say he got well paid for that. He certainly did. And I think that we're moving into an area of where we are at Celtic, Natasha, where I'm not going to refer to individuals as dead wood or rot, but there is a rot setting in at the club. There's a whole culture change required. Let's go back to the big culture argument that we've been talking about right back to when Neil Lennon questioned the culture of Celtic when things started to go awry this season. In order to make that culture, a big part of that culture change is the managerial aspect of it, because if you change certain people within an organisation, the culture, it could actually remain the same. You've got to have a root and branch change. And I know a lot of people are saying, well, I think he's jumping the gun here. A Celtic supporter saying that we need to completely restructure from top to bottom. But in order to change the culture, which has, slowly and gradually crept into Celtic Football Club, Natasha, the biggest part of that, beyond the football aspect, beyond the new manager, and we will get onto that because I've not heard any updates recently. I think the main part of changing the culture will be to change not only the CEO, but also it's time to move on, Peter Lawwell. And you thank him for everything that he's done. You criticise him for all the errors that have been made, particularly this season. But we move on.
Yeah, that's exactly it, Paul. And in any business, there is a reason that there tends to be a limit on how long a board member, a chief executive, spends at a club. Because you need that new perspective. You need it to be cyclical. You need to bring in new faces, fresh ideas, a new perspective. And you'll see it in any sort of business that a CEO has a maximum term. Peter Lawwell's been at the club for around 17 years now. That's far too long in any business, never mind the football club, which is perhaps more ever-changing than any other business. So it is time for him to move on. But he needs to move on completely. If now isn't the time, then I don't know what is. Obviously, this season was going to be the time regardless. A perfect fairy tale ending would have been for Celtic to have completed the 10, for Neil Lennon to move on, for Scott Brown to move on, for new faces to come in, for Peter Lawwell to move on. We've not had that fairy tale ending, but that doesn't take away from the fact that these people still need to and are going to move on. Neil Lennon's already moved on, Scott Brown's on his way out. Peter Lawwell does have to be the next piece in this puzzle to also move on. Mackay's been in, I know he's not been in for very long. Get 2, 3, 4 months working with Lawwell before taking over. That's fine then to let him be in that position and run with it. Now, I'm not saying that if he ever has a question that comes up, Peter Lawwell won't be at the end of a phone. If Celtic ever need to utilise a connection of Peter Lawwell's, I'm sure that from time to time there will be no harm in picking up the phone to Peter Lawwell. And I have no issues with that. Where I do start to have an issue is the suggestion that he must remain in some position of significance on the board, because that's far too formal and that keeps his influence very high. And Celtic fans have, already been critical of the influence Peter Lawwell has, perhaps in areas he shouldn't have influence in, transfer dealings and things like that. His presence in a formal role, director on the board, non-executive director, whatever it is, that presence is probably going to be too much for the fans to be happy with. And right now, Celtic need to stop doing things that make the fans unhappy. It's that simple. Bottom line, on the pitch they're making the fans unhappy, off the pitch they're making the fans unhappy. They need to turn this tide and start, having a bit of a momentum shift back to doing things that stop making the fans unhappy. If we come out, at the end of this social media silence with any announcement of Peter Lawwell staying, I think the fans would despair, to be honest.
I agree to the point where in AGSC Technology Videos agrees also that Lawwell being on speed dial for Mackay is no big issue. In fact, you would expect it, wouldn't you? You actually, when somebody has been embedded in the club in every aspect of the club for so long, you would absolutely expect that. My big concern, and I have nothing to back this up, this isn't me dropping in intelligence and information received, etc. My big concern is that Peter Lawwell obviously had been working very hard on other options for Celtic outside of Scottish football, and the Atlantic League is something that Dermot Desmond came out fairly recently and said we are no longer part of that. What then ensued was everything we've seen in relation to the European Super League announcement and everything that happened thereafter, and what is still happening at clubs like Manchester United, who it's almost sparked their fans into action against the owners of the club. But the discussion after the European Super League faltered was one of a British Super League. So I'm merely reading between the lines here. This is not information received or anything like that. But if the club were to look at the work that Peter Lawwell had done in relation to putting together a proposal for Celtic to be part of a Super League outside of Scottish football, and the announcement comes in that is the route that we're going to take and Peter Lawwell is going to be heading it, Natasha, is that something that could possibly be accepted, or would that actually make matters worse?
I think it would make matters worse, to be honest. I don't think there's going to be any acceptance of this at the moment. And you could debate that it could be helpful, it couldn't. I think the fans are so far down the line now of needing this current regime to move on that it's going to be very hard to come back to. And if Celtic come out and put forward, a solid, well-balanced reason for it being in place, I still don't think that the Celtic fans are going to take well to it. I think, like I said, I think we're far too down the path of needing the season to be over, the current regime to be over, a fresh start to be in place. That has to be the only option from here.
The other thing that's a concern, and I'm going to throw this one to Lawrence, because I think you mentioned it some time ago, Lawrence, is let's take the Eddie Howe scenario. And Eddie Howe's obviously got his links to Brendan Rodgers. He spent time in his own coaching development shadowing Brendan Rodgers. He's already said that he's still in touch with Brendan Rodgers, and we know the relationship that Rodgers had with Peter Lawwell. How damaging could that be, Lawrence, to any prospective managers coming in, doing their own due diligence, speaking to previous managers at the club who may not have had a good relationship with Peter Lawwell?
I think we spoke about this back in October, November. Any manager's going to speak to Brendan Rodgers or Martin O'Neill when they're coming in, and what kind of recommendation they're going to give. If we're talking about a culture change, do we need to, things that have annoyed the manager, getting players in too late for European qualifiers, not getting your first target. How often do we not get our first, second and third choice targets in a season? Players signed that you don't know anything about. I'm not too sure which, we've covered it quite a bit. What kind of manager wants to work under those circumstances? Listen, you can identify your targets, but score out the top three, because you won't be getting those. You might get somebody you know nothing about, but don't worry about that. And once you've had some of the biggest games of your season, we'll then get you players. And it's not just managers, that really frustrates, I think, the whole support. Going, we're gearing up for a European Champions League qualifier, and we've not made any signings.
Yeah, we're going to be lining up for the next one with near Beaton at centre half again. We're going to come into this, right, because there's loads to talk about. We're going to be speaking about Scott Brown. We're going to be speaking about the state of the Celtic squad, not just the performance at the weekend and many of the performances this season, but the entire squad and the kind of job that's required. Have a wee chat around the John Kennedy post-match, Natasha, to go onto the Celtic website to pick that one out, and also the David Turnbull announcement that he's in the shortlist for the Young Player of the Year, and then again tie that into the actual transfer policy that we've had and whether or not that should change. Now, I'm going to bring in a couple of names here of ex-Celts that I know are divisive figures within the support, because there has been a couple of them in the press recently. First up is Andy Walker. Now, I know Andy Walker is disliked by a great number of Celtic supporters. I remember he came out in January and spoke about the Dubai trip. Natasha was very succinct in his views about that. And it would appear, although not confirmed by the club, that Andy Walker has been banned from Celtic Park. Now, this goes back quite a while, actually, where I was party to a conversation. And I'm going back to 2011-12, where Andy Walker was speaking about the fact that Celtic, it was on the back of Celtic launching a season ticket campaign, and he was heard to say that in the press, Celtic fans don't need a season ticket, they can just walk up to the park, buy a ticket and go in these days. And the club were very, very unhappy with Andy's comments. Now, since then, I don't think the relationship's got any better. To the point, though, that you're banning a pundit, an ex-player, a pundit from Celtic Park. Now, here is the arguments for and against that. Now, you may or may not like Andy Walker. Andy Walker, believe it or not, is a Celtic fan, has been all his life. But he's also a pundit who criticises Celtic, as is the next ex-Celt I'll be speaking about. So if he is banned from the club, obviously he will be on media duties elsewhere, that's fine. What if a Celtic State of Mind continually criticise the club for their wrongdoings? What if a Celtic State of Mind continually criticise the fact that we went to Dubai, that we sold the fans down the river for 10 in a row, that we failed to capitalise on what Brendan Rodgers had built at Celtic, and that we failed to act all season? What if we continue? Because we've been criticising them all season for it, Natasha. Does that mean that we're going to be locked out of Celtic as well? And if so, is that only as pundits and not as fans? We'll still take our money as fans, but we're not allowed to get into press conferences as pundits, for want of a better word. Where do you sit on that, banning pundits for giving their opinion or criticising the club?
I'm sure our money will always be very welcome, so I'm sure we'll get back in. But touching on what you say about Andy Walker, perhaps for the first time in many, many years, I sat and listened to Andy Walker's comments about Celtic on Dubai and thought, I agree with him here. For once, he has accurately summarised the view of the fans, and he is representing the fans. He called the club detached. He said it was arrogant. He said that the club had a moral obligation not to have done that during a global pandemic while the fans were suffering. And I sat and listened to that and thought, for the first time, Andy, I fully agree with you here. And that was the point that Celtic chose to call him out on his comments and disagree with him. The first time he actually represented what the fans thought, that was what Celtic took issue with. I mean, for me, that just highlights how out of touch the club is with the feeling of the fans. So if that's what it took to ban him from Celtic Park, apparently, that concerns me. Mm-hmm. And you can't go banning pundits for things like that. I mean, come on. It's starting to get a bit propaganda, isn't it? Are we only going to let people comment on the club who say positive things? Mm-hmm. Are we only going to have journalists in who will then report back pre-approved messages from the club or the board? Are we only going to get in if we say what the board want us to say? No, we can't have that. That's not a balanced media of any sort.
No, I think you make a good point, and I'll come to Lawrence on this as well. I think for the moment, everybody that's watching, because before we even came on and I said that we're going to speak about this, people were coming in saying, Andy Walker is banned from Celtic, best news I've heard in ages. I know there's a feeling around Andy Walker and amongst the Celtic support. So for the moment, place that to one side. As it happens, I have had the opportunity to speak to Andy for something I was doing previously, and he was a lovely guy and he was quite clearly a Celtic supporter. However, if people want to take issue with what he says, that's their entitlement, and I'm not disagreeing with that in any way, shape or form. However, whatever your personal feelings are around Andy as a pundit, put them to one side for a moment and consider what Natasha's just said there. So what he said around the Dubai trip was what we were saying here on a Celtic State of Mind, largely. And not just me, not just you, but we go out every day with different contributors. I was saying pundits before. I don't know if we're pundits. I would say contributors. But we're all largely feeling the same way around the Dubai trip. Very few people were disagreeing with that. So Andy Walker was saying what we were all feeling. And as you say, if that is the straw that broke the camel's back, they've had an issue with him since 2011, 2012, to my knowledge. But that's the one thing that they took offence with. And I know that Neil Lennon called him out on the press conference. Remember the famous press conference, or infamous press conference following Dubai. If that's what it is, then I do think that there is an even bigger disconnect to what the fans are feeling. So what we've got there is we're banning pundits, we're sending out tweets being half of nothing, etc. And I'm going to go back to what Tony Haggerty said about that. Tweets don't win titles. I think this is small-time behaviour from Celtic. I really do. People may disagree, and that's fine. I'm expecting that. I'm expecting some people to disagree with me here. But I think this is small-time behaviour, Lawrence. What's your feelings on that?
Listen, I quite like Andy Walker. Part of the double-winning team. Even when he came back Hampden season, he done us a turn. I think it gives an honest opinion. Both the things you've highlighted, 2011, you could walk up to the ground and get a tick in the street. It was true. The by comments, they're true. Are we banning people for telling the truth? Or do we fall out for them when we tell us a truth we don't like? And from a PR side, I just think it's disastrous. Celtic's PR has been amateur at best, but surely you're better, even if you don't like what he's saying, you're better trying to manage that relationship. Better in the tent pissing out than outside the tent pissing in. But we're just burning bridges with the media. I don't know why he would do that. I don't see anything he's done that's deserving of it. There's certainly pundits out there that have been more comments about Celtic that are completely inaccurate, that haven't been banned from Celtic Park.
There's larger issues, Lawrence, isn't there, that we've not dealt with?
Oh, huge, thugs and thieves. Remember the newspaper headline? There's huge issues out there, and to ban a guy that was a great player for Celtic, and largely, as far as I can see, he gives an open and honest, frank opinion. You don't need to agree with it all the time, but his opinion seems to be kind of deeply held. I don't think he's got an agenda against us. I wouldn't say so. And if this is the thing that's done it, it's just crazy. And who's running our PR department?
Well, what's interesting? We've used the big C word, culture. This is the culture of the club, whereby you disagree with us, therefore we're going to close you down, we're going to shut you out. My kind of argument to that is, are they going to do the same with us? Not that we've ever had any kind of level of access to a degree. We've been called in a couple of times recently, but in the last 2 days we've been very critical of Dermot Desmond and Peter Lawwell. And again, we're all sitting here saying that Peter Lawwell shouldn't be at the club. Does that mean that our opinion doesn't count and we're not going to be invited to any of the future press conferences? Time will tell on that. Let's have a look on some of the comments coming through. Brian Watt, welcome to the show. You're commenting on YouTube. The one time Andy Walker hits the nail on the head and the club ban him. I did feel a bit like that, actually. When I heard this news, it's not confirmed by the club. I don't think they would confirm it, to be honest. Caplo Mark, Andy Walker was one of our players. He was a supporter as well, and he's well entitled to his opinion, agree or disagree. And there's quite a few coming in, for example here, so you're okay with Andy Walker going in Sky Sports stating we hate the Queen, actually that's okay. Well, I think that this decision hasn't been made on an isolated on the overall issue. Otherwise it would have happened long before now. As I say, the club took issue with some comments Andy made back almost 10 years ago. So it would appear that this is an isolated incident that has resulted in the decision being made. So previous comments that he's made, disagree or agree. I know that there are a lot of Celtic or ex-Celts that seem to stick the boot into our club time and time again. And there are others who stand up for the club. To the point, for example, when Neil Lennon's tenure was untenable, at that point, for example, John Hartson continually supported Neil Lennon, continually supported him, and that's loyal. That's loyalty to his friend and his ex-teammate. But then there comes a point where Big John said, actually, it's time to go. There comes a point, I think, where criticism is due at Celtic. As much as I hate hearing it, sometimes it is due. And if this is all around the Dubai trip, and as I say, that's not been confirmed yet by the club, but if it is around that, I think this is harsh. I do. I think it's harsh treatment. But I also think it says a lot about the culture that exists within the club, and we can feed that point into the previous point because Peter Lawwell's created that culture from the very top, Natasha, hasn't he?
Yeah, he has, and I think I have to agree with what you've said on it being small time, Paul. The club need to be able to accept criticism. This season has been a disaster, and there's absolutely no getting around that. And nobody can, with good conscience, report back on Celtic this season as in any sort of positive light. What's Andy Walker meant to do, or any other pundit meant to do, after the Dubai debacle or any other disastrous performance? Come out and talk positively about it? No, these pundits are paid to give their opinion. Similarly, as we come on here and give our opinion, it is simply that. It's an opinion on the goings on at the club, and right now the vast majority of people's opinion is that it isn't very good. If the club can't handle hearing that without banning people for it, then that sets a dangerous precedent, and again comes back to the culture of the club, and probably echoes what Walker has been saying about them being arrogant. If you can't take criticism, if you can't take someone calling you out when you get it wrong, that screams of arrogance to me. And that's the sort of culture at the club that I would like to see removed.
Now, I'm going to ask anyone who disagrees with us to make comments. I don't want the comments to be too one-sided, and I appreciate that the ones I've brought up probably in the main have been agreeing with what we're saying. So if you disagree with that, make your comments in the comments section, and we'll bring them into play and into the discussion. Kenny 67. Andy Walker knows the high standards Celtic should adhere to and are failing to reach, and the imposters at our club don't like the truth. So there's a lot of kind of support for Andy Walker actually in this scenario, but if you do disagree, come in and let us know. We know we did have one comment coming in saying that he has said our fans don't like the Queen. I don't remember that particular comment. I'm going to be honest with you, I don't remember that comment. So I know that he's been very critical over the piece. I don't feel that the way to deal with that is by banning him. I think that there's bigger problems at Celtic Park that we could be dealing with, and there's no way I'm going to make the viewers suffer a segue from Andy Walker to Charlie Nicholas, so I'll go into a different point before I do that. David Turnbull is in a shortlist, Lawrence Connolly, for the Scottish Football Writers Young Player of the Year, and he's up there with Nathan Patterson, Lewis Ferguson, Josh Doig. Now, of the other three names, for obvious reasons, I would sign two of them if we had the opportunity to sign two of those players. The success of David Turnbull, the disaster of some of the big name signings like Diego Laxalt from clubs such as AC Milan, buying players from the EPL, all the razzmatazz surrounding that. Does it show that perhaps Celtic need to get back to basics on this? We can actually get players from within Scottish football that will improve our side.
Yeah, we can, and it depends who's handling the recruitment, doesn't it? No, couldn't get John McGinn. He was in Scottish football for some reason. We couldn't get him over the line, but I think we should be looking at Ferguson, who looks tidy. Doig, I've not watched as much of, but yeah, he's an option. But what about the forward for Hibs, Kevin? He's 15, 16 goals. You've got to look everywhere. I don't know, what the scouts in the Scottish network are doing, but if he's scoring that for Hibs, we're struggling up front. Much did we pay for Paddy? Or Bio?
There or thereabouts.
$2 million for Bio.
Yep.
It's got to be a better option and cheaper. He's got to be a better option and cheaper. You're not worried about settling in Scotland then either, are you? You're thinking, well, I've seen an easy move for him. So, yeah, we should be looking at these clubs, and if they're on the young player the year shortlist, they're there for a reason, and they're one of the better players in the league.
No, exactly. I just think our policy obviously has evolved over the years, Natasha. You look back to the team that Andy Walker played in, largely made up of Scottish, Irish and English players. And, now there was so many reasons for the influx of overseas players, and it worked for a long time for Celtic. It certainly did, but I just think we need to strike a better balance. You can look at, even in the near history, some of the players that have come in from other Scottish sides, not necessarily Scottish, but from Scottish sides, like Scott McDonald came in, scored 30 odd goals in a season. Even Tony Stokes, Lee Griffiths. We've had successes coming in from other Scottish clubs. Somebody's going to point out that we bought Scott Griffiths from Wolves, because I know he had been at Hibs on loan. But when we're looking at players that we've kind of missed out on, McGinn being the big one, Lawrence, as you mentioned, and it only takes a matter of time when we're talking about Peter Lawwell to mention John McGinn, James McCarthy, Stephen Fletcher. There are players that would have improved their team, but I think that moving into this post-COVID world, Natasha, we really do need to look at some of the better Scottish youngsters. I look at the Hibs left back, Doig, and if we were to bring him in, and by the way, I'm going to look at the defence in a moment or two, because I think it is, we're in the worst state that we've been in my Celtic supporting life, actually, when we come to the defence next season. Let me jump over just to give you the options. Should we sell Chris Ayer for next season? Here are our options. So it'll be Bain or Barkas in goals, Ralston or O'Connor returning from Tranmere Rovers at right back, Taylor or Bolingoli at left back once he's fit, Welsh or Hjeld, who's 17 years of age and playing at Ross County on loan, Hendry or Beaton. Now, that is frightening, that we have allowed the mismanagement of this squad to get to the stage where that's our first and second choices as we sit, and we know that there's going to be transfer business done. But I look at Taylor or Bolingoli. Doig would at least be the second choice there, and he would be pushing for the first team jersey. There's nothing wrong with looking at the Scott Brown situation and saying, well, Lewis Ferguson would bolster our midfield. I just think we need to look differently at the transfers now.
I think that's right, and you only have to look at the long list of players that we signed for millions of pounds from overseas clubs to look at what a waste a lot of it has been. I think you've got to strike the right balance. I think there's certainly better buys in Scotland who have proven themselves in the Scottish League that could come in and do a job for Celtic. I think you have to probably supplement that and complement it with better quality players, from overseas leagues. If we have a squad with players like Turnbull, Ferguson, Doig, let's look at Ali McCann at St Johnstone, who's having a great season. Players like that, and supplement them with players at the level of Ayer and Edward. That's the sort of balance we need to be looking at. In the same vein, I do accept that we've bought from the Scottish League before. Let's use the example of Nadir Chishti. He was doing well in the Scottish League. That didn't work when we brought him over to Celtic. That didn't work at all. So there is risk. It doesn't mean if somebody is doing well for another team in Scotland, they're automatically going to come in and do well for Celtic. It's a big step up. It's a different level, and there's much different expectations. But I think there has to be that balance that I've talked about, that balance of, yes, looking at the better players in our league and complementing them with good finds from the European leagues. Now, the key issue we're having here is we're not finding the good players from the European leagues anymore. We're not finding the Wanyamas and the Van Dijks and the Dembelis. We need to try and get back to that. We need to start bringing more players from our youth system through. Not had many of them come through recently. If Stephen Welsh is doing okay, that's perhaps the exception. Mikey Johnston might prove to be okay next year. So if we can strike the right balance of taking the better players from the Scottish teams, improving our youth system and having product come through from there, and finding those hidden gems in Europe, that's the recipe for success. Saying it 1,000 times easier than doing it, but I think that's the sort of model that Celtic need to look at.
Yeah, without a doubt. Lawrence?
See, if you look at defence, we definitely need a new keeper. I just don't see Bain, and I don't see what we've been gaining by playing him. It was either, he's just not Celtic class. That first goal's poor. Left back, I'm quite happy with Taylor. I think Bolingoli's bridges are probably burned, but who knows what a new manager does. Jack Hendry, I don't know how he is after that tackle at the weekend, but best defender in Belgium. Perhaps he's got a future if he's going over there and putting in those kind of performances. Julian will be out for a while, but I don't know if he'll want to stay. Welsh is a third choice centre back isn't the worst. Right back we're going to have issues, I think, because O'Connor's has he been playing defensive mid at Tranmere?
He's been playing in midfield and also at right back. Yeah.
So I think Tony Ralston.
The confusing thing is there's two O'Connors at Tranmere Rovers, so.
Right, so team sheet, I'm not sure, but listen, Tony Ralston, I think his time's probably gone, so it's right back, and if we kept Ayer, that's where I'd shove him. But another strong centre half, a right back and a keeper, you could be settled enough, couldn't you? And if you sell Ayer,
And
you
it
know,
looks
if we're buying a
likely,
keeper, we're not
it looks
keeping
likely,
Barkas.
doesn't it, Lawrence? It looks likely that we will sell him, you know. Listen, we want as much balance as possible. So, you know, if Top Herd's 85, season 2021, the year sitting talking nonsense on a podcast qualifies you to run a football club. Is that you, Peter? Anyway, what I would say is, if you go to a restaurant and you buy a meal, right, you can still critique the meal, knowing that the person that cooked it's a far better chef than you. No, you've got to have your opinions. I'm not mocking you, pal. You've got to have your opinion. And when it's Celtic, and we're talking about Celtic, a club that we're all passionate about, then, you know, you could have absolutely no idea how to run a football club, but you know that the way that our club is being run at the moment, you know, and the amount of fans who are unhappy with that, then yeah, come on and air your views. What would you do differently, if anything, Top Herd? What would you do differently at Celtic? Or are we just all talking nonsense on a daily basis? There's plenty of nonsense being spoken. I certainly won't deny that, but there's a lot of sense in there as well, if you listen out. So if we're looking at the David Turnbull scenario then, Natasha, he comes in against Lille, performs very, very well. And again, you know, your mind can play tricks. You'd had a few games before. He'd started against St Johnstone up at McDermott Park, didn't play that well, but he certainly came into a game after that European performance, and I felt that when he came in, that him and Sorrow looked tremendous, as if they were giving us the wee bit of light at the end of the tunnel. Sorrow's obviously fallen by the wayside for the time being, and we'll talk about Scott Brown in a moment or two. But David Turnbull, I look at him and I'm looking at that Celtic squad and who we're going to build this new Celtic team around. He's like the jewel in the crown for me, David Turnbull.
He is. He's certainly one of the promising things that have come out of this season. I can't get carried away with his performances, to be honest. I was excited when he came in at the start, and I thought, yes, he is really going to work. We've really, you know, picked a good one here. He slightly disappointed me over the last few weeks, I have to say. But with that in mind, who hasn't? Who hasn't? It's very difficult to pull a performance out of the bag when the whole team are performing like that. I completely understand that. So it has sort of, you know, tempered my view on Turnbull slightly over the last few weeks. But he is one that is going to be here next season. He is a good player. Is he an excellent player? He perhaps can be. He's got potential to turn into a Stuart Armstrong type of player. He's not there right now, but I'm certainly willing to give him time, definitely in a new team and definitely under a new management structure, to reach that potential and to perhaps become that Armstrong type of player. If we get 2 or 3 seasons out of him and he fancies a move down south, that's our model now. So again, I wouldn't have too many issues with that. So yes, Turnbull for me is one of the names that is going to be on the team sheet next season, and it really is going to depend on what we put around him. Is it going to be Sorrow? We've tried to find a Scott Brown replacement for how many years now, and we've not been able to. And unfortunately, we've just not seen enough of Sorrow this season to know if it is going to be him and if he's capable of doing that. When he first started getting his chance, I thought, great, we need to see him. We need to see if he is capable of fulfilling that position. Unfortunately, it dropped right out of the picture again, so we've not had a chance to do that, and we can criticise that as well, really, as one of Kennedy's decisions, not playing Sorrow and continuing to play Brown, because I personally would have liked to have seen more of Sorrow. Again, Sorrow isn't getting enough chance for me to really properly assess him for next season. I know he got a bit of time at the end of the Rangers game there, and I think he probably did more than Brown when he came on. I think he's got that energy, that drive. He gets stuck in, and Paul Brown just looked slightly off the pace. So Sorrow and Turnbull for me, definitely two to keep strongly in the mind as a centre midfield pairing for next year. But it's really going to depend what we put around them, isn't it?
It definitely is. Now, I did ask for some balance on the Andy Walker debate, and Stephen McNulty's come in to say Andy Walker is a disgrace. His punditry makes him out to have been a superstar. Our youth policy, on the other hand, has recently been a waste of time. We are a feeder group for SPFL and lower leagues. So I know and always knew that the Andy Walker debate would divide opinion. I just think as a football club we need to, rise above that kind of thing, banning specific pundits from the stadium or from the ground. And then particularly if that person has been an ex-player at Celtic, I find that a very difficult one. So I'm sure that debate will rage on. I'm going to have to use that as a segue, because you brought up the Scott Brown situation, Natasha, into some of the comments that have been made around Scott Brown, again from ex-Celts. Now, I'll start to try and cushion the blow by using the comments made by Andy Lynch, first of all, good pal of mine, Andy, having worked with him on his autobiography. And he doesn't reckon that Scott Brown will be a big loss. He won't be missed. Lawrence Connolly, how can you say that about a Celtic legend, someone who's won, I think, 22 trophies at the club? I mean, the club are asking us to go to the St Johnstone game and, give them banners of support and a farewell to Scott Brown. He is a legend. Surely he's going to be missed.
Listen, I'd say he was a legend. I'd probably say he was missed this season. Where was he? It wasn't the Brown of old this season, was it?
No.
Too few games did he turn up. So I think, but we tried one season too long. Natasha's touched on it. Kennedy, why wasn't he playing Sorrell? Especially when he'd come in and done well. What was the future? Especially after, what was that again? Especially after Brown had announced he was moving to Aberdeen. Play Sorrell. Well, then out of Cup. What's that again? Sticks out. Sorrell in, he sticks with Brown. It's a strange one. Why we won't put Sorrell in and let's have a decent look at him and see what he can do. There's words that Spurs are meant to be sniffing around him. It's baffling, really, Kennedy's decision making on
why. Does that surprise you about Sorrell? The Spurs, is that just paper talk, do you think?
Could be just paper
talk. They're looking at him thinking we can do a Wanyama on him.
Yeah, listen, there could be possible. What you've seen of him, he covers the ground quickly. I know he gave away a goal at the weekend, maybe he was a bit rusty, but his distribution generally is alright. He's going to tackle, he closes the game down well. So they're maybe saying that, the boy's got some talent. That could be a bargain and get picked up there. He's not really playing at Celtic. Maybe there's a deal to be done. So they could be looking at that, which would be a shame if he went on elsewhere and we'd missed out on. But I mean, how many games has he played now? It's not a lot, is it?
No, the big thing for me is you've got the analytics and people can give you all the figures and you use them and utilise them to craft out your view on certain players. And I think after the game or during the game, I was watching Brown's performance. I was pretty critical of Scott Brown. He's just not at the races a lot of the time. He's not tracking back. When you look at the movement of Ryan Kent, for example, he's leaving Brown for dead time and time again. I think when you bring on Sorrell gets much more touch tight to the player. But the one thing with me in Sorrell that I am concerned about, and I raised this, is that he gives away so many needless fouls. He just niggles and niggles, and you think that he's going to be in the referee's book within 20 minutes, especially when you look at the refereeing at the weekend, Lawrence. He's going to be in the referee's book pretty quickly, and maybe that was on the mind of John Kennedy going into that game. I hope it wasn't sentimental. But Brown was way off the pace, Natasha, and to be honest with you, I thought it was a sad ending to his big time, if you want to call it that, Celtic career. It was the biggest game he's going to have between now and end of the season. It was sad to see him so off the pace.
It was. And I do actually put a bit of blame on Celtic for this. We haven't adequately replaced Brown and haven't given Sorrell the chance to be his replacement. So we've had to continue to drag out a Scott Brown who is past his best. And that's Celtic's fault, putting Brown in that position that we've not been able to replace him, so he must play. He was off the pace. There's no taking away from what Scott Brown has done for the club over the past however many years it's been now, 14 years or whatever it is. Every fan can recognise that and thank Scott Brown for everything he's contributed. He has been an incredible servant to the club and one of these modern day legends. No taking that away from him at all. He was off the pace at the weekend. He is past his best. Will we miss him on the park? Going by this season's performances, perhaps not, but it's no way possible to say that Celtic won't miss Scott Brown next season and the impact of someone of that stature around the club. We've said on the show many times before, there must have been a role for Scott Brown next year. I don't say he needs to play every game or any game, or maybe 20 minutes here and there is going to be more suitable. But there must have been some sort of capacity for Scott Brown to remain in a coaching role behind the scenes. That sort of influence is something I think we're really going to miss next season. I don't know who at the club is going to have that presence and is going to be that figure. I mean, we've touched on it a million times. The rebuild project is massive. The instability is going to be massive. Losing a presence like Scott Brown is going to be missed, and I don't know how you can say otherwise.
It definitely will be missed, and we'll get on to Charlie Nicholas's comments in a second or two. But again, for balance, I've mentioned Lewis Ferguson. I've always liked what I've seen with Ferguson. He's not a finished product yet. Zinko comes in to say that he agrees with Lazarus. Lewis Ferguson is not that good. He is average at best. And John Paul Connors, Ferguson, although good, is on to a loser. If teams plays badly, he will get slated regardless of whether it's his fault or not because of his family. Best to stay away. I do think that he is one of the best talents certainly in the league. Doig is only 18, reminds us Paul Caldwell. Yeah, I think he's a brilliant talent. I mean, you look at the amount of games that he's actually played this season. But your point there, you look at Scott Brown, as we sit here, 41 appearances this season, Natasha, near Beaton, who I think's about 7 years younger, and who can be utilised in the same position. Whether or not you think it's as good, 21 appearances. So when you look at how a player's been managed, Natasha, 21 appearances for Beaton, 41 for Brown, and I know there's been injury issues there as well, but I don't think we've managed Scott Brown ever since, even Brendan Rodgers' last season. He's played far too much football.
Yeah, and that's it, and that's what we've touched on. It's not fair on Scott Brown that Celtic are putting him through this. I'm sure Scott Brown, the type of person he is, will want to continue playing and giving everything he can for the club, so I don't think he would say it's unfair. But in some way, it is, and it's not the first time that Celtic have done this. We didn't have a replacement for Tierney, so Tierney constantly had to play using painkilling injections and play when perhaps he shouldn't have because we didn't adequately have a backup for him. McGregor, similarly, we've had to play him over the last few seasons in so many games. I remember reading the article that Celtic put out at one point, not last season, I think it was the season before, about how McGregor had played the most games for his club in European football, and they put it out as if that was some sort of accolade, as if that was a great achievement. And I remember thinking at the time, what sort of achievement is that? If we've got to play this guy more than any other player in European football because we have nobody who can step in and do his role in any game, be it a lower cup round or be it to a lower team in the league. We had nobody else who could do his role, so he still had to play all those games. To me, that's not an accolade. That's a failure in having squad depth. And again, we failed in not having squad depth in terms of a replacement for Scott Brown. So the fact that he is still playing this amount of games this season at his age is a failure by the club to adequately replace him.
It is. I mean, the McGregor question, let's drop him against Ross County in the Cup. It's nonsense. It really is. Now, to go on to a point being made by Mark Campbell, why are you talking about Ferguson and Doig when we have Henderson and Robertson? Give the kids a chance. Well, I agree with you. Yeah, I would love Celtic to give our own youth players a chance, but I think that's the reason why we're talking about Ferguson and Doig. Ferguson got a game at Hamilton. He won himself a move to Aberdeen. Doig has played plenty of games with Hibs. I think he had a loan deal at Queen's Park. So at the age of 18, these guys have got a lot more games than our own 18-year-olds, and that's, I think, what the problem is, to be fair, Mark. But I would much rather, we just dipped into our own second string for our left-back who has maybe already been managed into the team. I mean, we threw Welsh in and he'd only had one appearance previous to that. That should never happen. These guys should be managed into the team. Callum McGregor over the last 9 years, there's no way he had to play as much football as he did. There's plenty of games that you could bring in a player and have Callum McGregor on the bench in case things weren't going your way. But how many games did we win at a canter at home against the bottom half of the table in the league so many times, and we didn't have to be given, I think was it 67 games or something that season you're referring to, Natasha, where he had played more football than anybody else in Europe. And then you just need to look at Kieran Tierney, whose name's been brought up a few times as well. Kieran Tierney's injury problems, it's almost as if he's going to have these injury problems throughout his career. What's that down to? The fact that we always played him. The minute he came into the team, he was never out the team. Was it too much football? Too young, as they said back in the punk days, Lawrence. Now, I'm going to bring up Charlie Nicholas. And again, he's another one of these players that Celtic fans like to maybe separate the player from the pundit rather than the man from the art. And he talks about Scott Brown isn't a legend at Celtic, he says. He's not a legend, Natasha. It's just incredible. And he also thinks that Sorrow's not good enough to replace him. So Charlie Nicholas hasn't got much nice words to say about Celtic at the moment.
Does he?
Now, I take offence with this though, Lawrence, and you might agree. He goes on about how bad Celtic were the second time round when he played for them. And by the way, I've seen most of the games and I agree with him. They were rotten. But he names players that he played alongside. I mean, I played with Wayne Biggins, Carol Muggleton, Tony Cascarino, and get this, Rudy Vata.
Rudy was good, mate.
Rudy's not part of that group, Lawrence.
Muggleton, did he not set a shutout record in minutes or something in the first 7 games or 6 or 7 games? I can't remember, but Rudy was a decent player. And then he went on in the Bundesliga after us and had a few seasons in the Bundesliga in Germany, didn't he?
Rudy Vata, yeah. The thing with Muggleton, he played 13 games, and in those 13 games he conceded less goals than Arthur Boric. Now, I'm not saying he was a better goalie, but I think he suffered from having an unfortunate name. And he played in a very, very bad Celtic side. But I'm not having Rudy Vata. There's no chance I'm having Rudy Vata in that category.
No, Rudy was a decent player. Scored free kick at Hampden, I believe. But yeah.
And by the way, his son is
he scored the other day.
Up trees, yeah, absolutely.
His son.
Natasha, Charlie's comments, Scott Brown's not a legend. That's just nonsense, isn't it?
Oh, come on. He surely is only saying that to keep his name in the newspapers. I have no idea how anybody who has watched Scott Brown over the last few years at Celtic and during his career can say he is not a legend. It is a word that is used far too regularly and far too easily in football at the moment, but it's certainly not misused in the case of Scott Brown. What he's achieved at Celtic is unlikely to ever be replicated. You no longer get players who come to a club like Celtic and give it their whole career as much as he has done. What he's achieved in terms of his trophy haul is just one aspect of what he's given and achieved for the club. His presence on the pitch, off the pitch, can only be commended. And if Scott Brown isn't a legend of Celtic Football Club, then I don't know who is, because his contribution has been absolutely remarkable, and I think the fans will always look back on that fondly. So regardless of what Charlie Nicholas is trying to do with that statement, Scott Brown is certainly a Celtic legend.
Yeah, I mean, invincible treble captain, a true invincible domestic season. You know, one where you don't lose games. Quadruple treble winning captain. It's, you know, what do you have to do?
What do you have
that's
to do?
just the last 4 years when he's been on the wane. He's
one of only 12 players to make more than 600 appearances for the club, 500 appearances rather, but he has actually made over 600. So I disagree with you, Charlie. Edward Diver, let's have a wee look to see what Edward's saying. Charlie was just a goal digger, not a Celtic great. Now, the one thing I did learn about Charlie Nicholas is, you know, when I was growing up and I wasn't allowed to go to the games, Charlie was on everybody's tongue. This was first time round, Lawrence. He was the real poster boy for Celtic back then. You know, he scored something ridiculous in a season, 50 goals in a season. He broke a leg. He was tremendous. Everybody wanted him. Spurs, Liverpool, Arsenal, and obviously he went for the bright lights of London. But interesting enough, having dug about and had the opportunity on one occasion to speak to Charlie Nicholas, Celtic sold him. And for years and years, it was always that, you know, Charlie was a goal digger back then and he wanted out of Celtic. He had no decision. He had absolutely no choice. Celtic sold him. Yep. If you believe Charlie, I'm not going to call him a liar. You might disagree with his opinion, but he didn't want to leave Celtic first time around. He felt it was too early. I remember reading Billy McNeil, one of Billy McNeil's autobiographies, where he reckoned Nicholas was a more naturally gifted player than any other player that he had managed at Celtic. So, you know, the talent was undoubted, but when it comes away with things that you just can't back up, like Scott Brown's not a legend, you've just got to say, come on, Charlie. And I know that the way that works, and it's a ghost-written piece for a tabloid, but he should be getting the sign-off, and if he's unhappy with the wording of that, it shouldn't go out. Before we get on to John Kennedy and the whole managerial scenario, Natasha, it's taken us about 54 minutes to talk about the manager. The Celtic women's team are going from strength to strength. Another resounding victory at the weekend.
8-0, mate.
Yeah, brilliant, isn't it? Brilliant. There's a team who are still giving it absolutely everything to get themselves into, if not the top spot, second spot in that Champions League position. Yeah, absolutely brilliant. They're continuing to go from strength to strength. I think the performances are getting better every time I see them play. Big weekend coming up because Glasgow City and Rangers actually play each other. So those are the two teams ahead of Celtic at the moment. One of them or both of them are going to drop points, and Celtic are hopefully going to capitalise on that and get themselves closer, if not get that second place spot if Glasgow City win. So yeah, it's another big weekend in the Women's League, and I encourage anyone who's not already given it a chance to watch it. If it's not on somewhere like BBC Alaba, then it'll certainly be a link available to watch it online, which the Celtic women's team usually tweet out, so keep an eye out for that. Watch the women's game. You know, the links they put out usually are only £3 or £4. Give it a go, have a watch, and watch a team with a lot of fight, a lot of desire, a good amount of technical ability, still competing in a competition that's all to play for. So give it a go and have a watch.
Oh, definitely. There's a lot of high-scoring games as well, and I think that comes down to, you know, there's really 4 strong teams in the league: Glasgow City, Celtic, Rangers and Hibs. And when the others meet, anything can happen. You see scores sometimes going into double figures, and they're playing part-time teams though, Natasha, aren't they, a lot of the time? So
that's the issue. Yeah, there is that massive discrepancy. You know, when I hear it compared to, well, you know, there's a big difference between the finances of Celtic and the finances of Hamilton. Yes, there is, but Celtic and Hamilton are both full-time professional football clubs in the men's sector of it. You can't compare that to Celtic women's team playing Forfar. You know, those girls are part-time. You know, it's not professional. So there's a massively wider discrepancy there, which is why we do see the bigger scores. But only through, you know, promotion of the game and developing it can we start to make the league more competitive. And it's great now to have 4 really top teams competing rather than just the perhaps 2 or, you know, 1 we've seen in previous years.
13 in a row for Glasgow City, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right.
We'll get some more comments coming in from YouTube, Facebook and Twitter. Frank Brennan, welcome to the show, Frank. Get a grip, everyone, please. Rudi Vata was an honest trier, but only ever average, just like that Vidar Riseth 2 years later. The description average was specifically created for Vata and Riseth. Now, I get what you mean. He certainly wasn't a superstar, and there's loads of players like that who come in and there's a contribution. But what I was trying to say, he certainly can't be put in the category of a Wayne Biggins or a Tony Cascarino, who for me were never anywhere near Celtic class. And Rudy's got a great story as well, hasn't he? I mean, he was an asylum seeker when he came to Celtic, and you know, brilliant story. And he's a great guy, and I hope that we have the privilege of seeing his son playing for Celtic's first team in years to come. Now, Andy echoes Scott. We really are a small club if Brown is classed as a legend. It's a difficult one to describe because you can't define legend or great. I think the only one that's actually easy to say is a cult icon. You can say someone's a cult icon. I think Rudi Vata's a cult icon. There you go. But I think he is a legend, Andy, because you look at people who are generally respected as legends within the history of Celtic Football Club, and they haven't achieved anywhere near as much as Scott Brown. And as I say, longevity there as well. In this day and age, in the modern day, that's unusual for a player to be at a club for 14 years, what he's achieved, the games he's played. So I've got to disagree with you on this one, Andy. I think he is a Celtic legend, even though we've not seen the best of him this season. Now, John Kennedy is the final point that we want to discuss here, Natasha. Now, there's a movie that maybe before some people's time who are tuning in, from 1993, where Phil Connor says, "I'm reliving the same day again and again." The movie was called, Lawrence?
Groundhog Day.
Groundhog Day. So here's a couple of quotes from John Kennedy following the Rangers game. Now, these could have been actually following any game this season. "When the ball came into the box, we didn't defend it well enough. Our general play is fine. We need to stop conceding soft goals."
See the ball coming into the box. Is that not general play?
The Rangers game at the weekend, Natasha. I mean,
yeah, like you said, that could have been any game this season. We've been calling that out for months and months. My question to him is, why aren't you fixing it then? Okay, well, you were a coach, absolutely. Maybe you weren't the one in charge on the training ground. You had influence. Why didn't you fix it then? Now you're the person in charge. You're the manager. Why aren't you fixing it now? We don't need you to tell us what the problems are. We can all see them. We've all been watching Celtic all season. We know what the problems are. We don't need you to tell us that. We need you to fix it. Sadly, he's not doing that. It's a disappointment for me. And I have been disappointed with Kennedy on the whole, to be honest. I think we're going to look back over his 10 games in charge and just see it as a bit of a missed opportunity for him. You know, there was a chance for him to stamp his own identity in the squad. He change the formation, change the shape, bring in youth players, be bold, go for 2 up front, play Griffiths and Edward together at Ibrox. He didn't do any of that. He didn't really change anything. The performances didn't really change. The results didn't change. For me, it looks a bit like he was trying to protect his own reputation, avoid any major defeats, keep the ship steady to the end of the season, which is a bit self-serving, if I'm honest. And it hasn't worked either, has it? What's that, 3 wins? That's not going to do him any favours. So, yeah, a bit of a disappointing 10 games I think we're going to look back on for John Kennedy.
We were talking earlier in the week about him just being bold and doing what he felt, you know, might have put his kind of authority and his style on the team. I mean, those words there could have been scripted by Neil Lennon. That's the kind of thing we've been hearing all season. People are coming in to agree and disagree with us here, Lawrence, which is always great. Great crack on the Bulletin. Monty comes in, Antar Boric is a god, I love that man. Well, I'm just waiting for somebody to say that I compared him to Carol Muggleton earlier on and said Muggleton was a better goalie, which I didn't say, obviously. Cherry Bombs, Cascarino on paper was a fantastic signing, like Bratback. It just didn't happen. What I would say, Cherry Bombs, is if you get an opportunity, read Tony Cascarino's book. It's called Full Time. It's incredible, and he admits in there that by the time he came up to Celtic, he had an issue with his fitness and he had a gambling issue at that time as well, and he really wasn't, his head really wasn't fully tuned into what Celtic were all about, and it was probably a bad time for him to come up to the club. And obviously we suffered because you know, we spent a lot of money record signing, but we did get Tommy Boyd from Lawrence.
Indeed. Another treble winning captain. Would he count as a legend? I would say so, but perhaps treble winning captains aren't. I don't know, mate, but I would definitely count them. But yeah. JK saying, you know, our general play was fine, it's just balls into the box. Well, that's kind of general play. You've got to guess that the opposition's going to try and put the ball in your box and score against you. I would
precisely.
think,
yeah.
You know,
it's general defending as well. We're probably going to have another podcast to try and differentiate between a legend and a great Natasha, because there's a lot of comments coming in about that. But for me, every day of the week, Scott Brown, legend.
Yes.
And I hope he's remembered as that as well, even though we've had a disappointing season. Listen, it's been very busy on the comments field, so thank you very much for getting involved via Twitter, Facebook and YouTube. It's always great on a Tuesday to catch up with Lawrence, Connolly and Natasha Meikle. Thank you both so much for joining me on a Celtic State of Mind.